Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
All right, so I'm gonna wait at least till 9, maybe till like 9:01 to see if everybody's able to log on. Thank you for your flexibility. I appreciate it. Okay, most of you are here, so it looks like a couple other people are maybe logging on. So I'm taking attendance. That's what you see me doing when I'm looking down here. So again, just to check in, see how everybody's doing. I do attendance for those reasons. Okay. Well, welcome to the virtual classroom again. So yes, my daughter, we found out on Monday that there was a known case in her class. So we are just waiting. It was a little too early to test her. So we're going to take her in today to get her tested and see what's happening. I don't know if it's psychosomatic or not, but both my husband and I, wait, does my throat hurt? Am I coughing? Is that allergies or like, is there a different reason my nose is running? So he's going to go get tested today as well. So I will just keep you all updated in terms of, where we're at with everything. Hopefully it'll turn out we're all fine and I'll be able to be back on campus on Friday. But a big part of that would depend on whether her school reopens or not, because originally it was just, and then they found out one of the office workers also tested positive, so the whole school is closed today. So, we're just gonna play it by ear, figure it out as we go, and keep going. So hopefully you all read the part of the email where I said the test will now be Monday. Looking at the amount of material we had, even if I was in person, it would probably be difficult to get through it today, to be perfectly honest. So I think moving it to Monday is fine, and then we'll just sort of shift the syllabus as need be. My guess is the topic that we're covering next, which I think is how to science, 3 days dedicated, so I'll probably just condense it to 2, and then we'll be caught up. The other thing that you have coming up that I want to keep on your radar is your topic for your project. So let me reopen the syllabus because I was just looking at this. That is due a week from today. And I am going to be today sending out some information that might help you as you consider doing, how do I do this topic? Yeah, I will send that in Blackboard announcement and probably post it on Blackboard as well. So thank you to those of you who were able to come to the library on Monday. Hopefully that was somewhat helpful. I know that Stephen Leist has a very different presentation style than I do. Whereas I talk about a minute, right? He is quite the opposite. But I know obviously that he has a lot of great resources and ways to look things up. So any feedback from that session that I can pass along to him? And again, in the Zoom world, you can feel free to type in the comments. You can unmute yourself, or you can use the raised hand feature, or just say in the comments, like, I have something and I'll call on you. All right. Oh, there we go. Uh,
I'm sorry, that was not for that. That was something else. But
okay.
I think it was really interesting. It helped out with just studying in general, or like not necessarily studying, but research purposes in general. Because I have a lot of research projects this semester, and that was, I don't know, it gave me a lot of different outlets to look at. Because I never like go to the library's website, I just go straight to Google Scholars, and if it's not there, then we're good. I guess it's just not happening. So
Yeah, I mean, we do have access, and the reason I asked him to repeat the thing about how we link Google Scholar with our library is I've never done that, and I'm like, oh man, that would help me so much. So even just knowing that, I think is going to make a huge difference for me, and I would imagine for y'all as well. Yeah, we have so many great resources available. And every time Stephen goes over stuff, I learn something new. Like you can link Google Scholar to your school's library. Who knew? Okay. Yeah. Any other comments, feedback? All right. Well, again, thank you for coming. And last Friday, we started talking about the various types of sources that we can find, which Stephen also obviously reinforced as well. I'm just going to do a couple things to get us going. I'll turn our captions on. And then I'm also going to make sure that chat is pulled down on my second monitor in case anyone wants to put questions or comments there. Alrighty. So we had gone over sort of more of a general one, and just to like refresh your memory, this is what it looked like, right? And then this is the one that's the hierarchy of scientific evidence. So Stephen kind of referred to this the other day, but this also will come in a lot of handy as you think about sources and what should you be using essentially. So, these are the type of things on the pyramid that you would run into as you went through those databases or Google Scholar, right? So for the lowest in terms of things you'll run across there are case reports. So case reports would be typically based off someone in therapy. It's like one person, right? So it can be a really nice starting place for things, but typically it doesn't give us nice, like overall generalization. Sometimes you'll find like opinion pieces or letters to the editor in these as well. Again, these are helpful, but they certainly are not the pinnacle of science. Let's just put it that way, right? They're not the best evidence, right? But if you were talking about, something like your controversy project for this class, right? The letters to the editor might be interesting to see how scientists have argued about them, right? Next up in the hierarchy is animal trials and in vitro studies. So these would be, testing things in animals like basic learning abilities. If we're looking at more psychiatry, it might be like medicine trials, right? And things along those lines. I would say probably what you run into most of the time is going to be something in the next two, either cross-sectional studies or case control studies. So cross-sectional studies are the vast majority of survey-based research that we see. It's cross-sectional because you're only looking at one point in time. Sorry, you're gonna hear my daughter in the background. You're only looking at one point in time, and so you can only really pause it based on this one time they sat down and filled out a survey for you, right? And then case control is the next step up from that. And here's where you might start to get into some experiments where you've got people coming into the lab again one time, and they are going to do something in the lab where you try to control everything else. Cohort or longitudinal studies are sometimes considered sort of the gold standard in terms of looking at concepts in science, and particularly in psychological science. So the idea with a cohort study is you start at one time point and you follow them for a long period of time. Perhaps you follow them for months or years. So some of the more famous longitudinal studies start when the kids are pretty young, maybe 2, 3, and then go until they're 18. Obviously, this is time consuming, very expensive, right? So unless you have a lot of grant money, not a lot of scientists can actually do these types of studies, but they are obviously excellent and good to have as well. And whenever we run across one of these, it starts to give you more of sequencing of things, right? So I think of one of the more famous longitudinal studies in my field is they looked at, I think it was like pre-adolescence, again, till they were like 18. And they found out that, if you are experiencing certain things at time 1, right? So you're consuming a lot of media that portrays the unrealistic ideals, right? You're getting a lot of messaging about the fact that you need to look a certain way or you should diet to do that. That predicts subsequent body image disturbance. And that is something that from cross-sectional studies we have conjectured, right? But we couldn't really tell which one came first until that longitudinal study was done. So these are really important, but again, hard to do. You tend to have a lot of drop off of people who just move, right? Or decide they don't want to be in the study anymore. So often these sample sizes have to be very large so that at whatever the end time point is, you have that. Randomized control trials are, in psychology, we think about them for therapy or for like a prevention intervention. And so the idea here is you compare therapy to something else. So perhaps you're comparing doing a new type of therapy to treatment as usual, what the therapy is that's typically been done. Or perhaps you're doing the new type of therapy compared to what we call like a waitlist control, where the people are going to get the therapy, but they have to wait to get it. This is the way we really can show that types of therapy are helpful, are efficacious. And so these are very often done. The big conference I go to in November, which I found out is virtual this year, which is probably good. A lot of people are presenting randomized control trials for new variations on therapy or taking a therapy that exists and applying it to a new disorder, perhaps a new issue. And then at the top of the hierarchy of scientific evidence is what we call meta-analyses or systematic reviews. So a meta-analysis is where you take existing studies, and they could be sort of all these types of studies, typically only ones with data, like the case reports you typically not include. And you essentially make each published study its own data point. And so you create this new data set where instead of each participant in a study being a data point, each study itself becomes a new data point. And then you do analyses based on that. And the reason we do this is to sort of see overall, looking at all the studies in this area, all the research in this area, what are the trends we're finding? This becomes very, very important in subgenres of psychology where they tend to have small sample sizes. So I think we've talked in here before about how expensive it is to do brain imaging studies, for example. And so those studies sometimes only have 20 people in their sample sizes. And so they would go that direction. Let's go ahead and look at all these studies that only have 20 people, right? And so then when you combine them all, now instead of a sample size of 20 people, you might have a sample size of 2,000 people, right? And then you do an analysis looking at what's called the effect size that sort of allows you to compare across different types of studies, different types of analyses, and then you are able to get, again, that overall trend. Meta-analyses, depending on how rich the literature is, can actually be pretty quick. So I've seen meta-analyses where there's fewer than 20 studies in an area, for example. I'm currently working on a meta-analysis that's a follow-up to one I had published in 2009. And there are over 600 possible studies for us to code. So it really does depend on what the question is you're looking at. What I really like about this as well is that it clearly points out what is not scientific evidence, right? So it's not personal anecdotes. It's not gut feelings you have about something. It's not some guy you know or some guy on the internet, right? Alrighty, so let's go ahead and get initial gut reactions to this. Is this something you all have seen before? Is this something that is new information? And what are your takes on it?
I definitely haven't seen anything specifically like this in regards to like scientific evidence before, but it puts it into a lot of perspective and definitely makes sense when you think about like how to analyze what kind of evidence you want to use when doing research.
Yeah, I think that that's a really nice way of thinking about it. Yeah, I mean, we tend to think, well, if it's in a database, it's got to be great, right? And they are all relevant, right? But yeah, this shows you sort of what's more stringent, what's going to give you sort of the strongest evidence for something. Other thoughts?
Yeah, kind of the same, but like it's nice to have in an order of, you know, the best to things that maybe aren't quite as, you can't base everything off of it. It's nice to have that like in writing kind of this. So when you are doing research, you can say, okay, well, this is a meta-analysis. So this is going to be like something I want to base a lot of my research on, or, you know, vice versa. It's nice to have like the word that I can't think of.
That's okay. I think we're all going to have some word finding problems this morning. Yeah, I think that that's really true, that this is something you can use as you look at articles. Okay, like, and again, this is not saying that you should chuck all cross-sectional studies because they're down further on the pyramid. I mean, you're going to find a lot of cross-sectional studies, and that's fine. And some of them are very well done, right? It's just they don't give you quite as much information as, say, a meta-analysis. I mean, anytime, even if, let's say, a cross-sectional study has 1,000 participants in it, it's still one study done by one group, right? And so there could be some inherent bias, either in the researcher's questioning or, honestly, in the participants. So just related to that. So I did a study a few years back where I collected data with some of the professors that were my professors in undergrad. We're now like research collaborators, which is really cool. And so they collected data in Ohio, and then I collected it here. And we saw some different relationships. Like people here seem to be more self-conscious about their bodies in some ways. And what we sort of hypothesized or surmised from that is it might have to do with, you know, being in a beach town where you might be wearing, you know, less clothing, right? Whereas in Ohio, you might be more covered up due to the weather, right? Again, that's just a guess, but you could certainly see different cohorts giving you different things or different cross-sectional studies. Yeah. Well, alrighty, let's keep going. A couple other nice sources here. So this one gives you a really nice breakdown of the hierarchy of scientific evidence. I love that they just start with, these are things that are not scientific evidence at all. And natural news, which we saw before, right? Andrew Wakefield, we've talked about. Jenny McCarthy, if you're not familiar with her, she's a big anti-vaxxer. YouTube videos, unless they're from scientists, right? Things along those lines. And then it kind of goes through the same walkthrough and can be, again, really helpful to look at in a lot more detail than I want to throw up on a PowerPoint slide for y'all and have you squint to read. But this is a really nice reference. The other thing I linked here that I thought was great was the infographic Stephen Leish shared with us. And let me see if I can get this bigger. Yeah. It's loading slowly. I thought that this was really great. And as he said, you know, there are some things that probably surprise us about where some folks ended up, right? Like I was actually kind of surprised that the Washington Post was more left-leaning when I was in college. It was actually between that and the New York Times, the more right-leaning of the two. So sort of interesting to see that that has shifted, right? And then things like Mother Jones, you'll see a lot of people sharing stuff from Mother Jones and kind of talking about it as if it is a very reputable source. Maybe it's, you know, not that problematic, but you know, it's doing more of a mix of reporting facts and analysis, right? And analysis is not a bad thing. Oh, if you have a link for that, that would be great, Will. But yeah, you know, like analysis is good, but we just need to know it's analysis. And so, you know, if it's presenting it as just facts, right? But it's actually doing more like analysis / starting to get into opinion, that's where it becomes problematic. Obviously things like InfoWars, right, are very, very problematic. You know, that these are nonsense and damaging to public discourse. And you will see there are things on the liberal side for that as well, right? And there are things that are more in the middle, like the National Enquirer. If you're not familiar with what the National Enquirer is, it is the thing that you see in the newsstand, right? And when you go to the grocery store that has things like Monkey Boy born and things along those lines. Yeah, Elvis was an alien. They kind of jokingly use it in the movie Men in Black as like, this is our best source of information, right? You know, but not actually true. So did appreciate that they were on here at all. All right, and Will has sent us all a link to a file that's the updated one. So feel free to peruse that as well. All right, so we've been talking a lot about scientific literacy. Y'all know what it is now, but I think that one of the things that's most important that I want to keep emphasizing you is that scientific literacy involves a willingness to change our minds, right? It is not just, well, the science is right and therefore like the science will always be right, right? It is recognizing that with new information, we might have to revise our ideas about it. And as we've talked about previously, we have various psychological processes, including like the my side bias, right, that fight against it. So, you know, one of the things with this is we really, as humans, don't want to get rid of an idea we find valuable. Again, as some of the examples we've used in the past, things from, you know, you got to stay 6 feet apart for COVID. If it's aerosol, probably not actually going to help, right? Or things as extreme as, you know, well, vaccines are harmful. So why is life easier when we just say, yeah, we'll just believe things, we won't analyze the evidence, we'll just, you know, go with what's there, go with what other people are saying?
I mean, I don't want to say like that, but it's easier to be ignorant. Like, it really is. It's easier to be ignorant because you can just like, oh, okay, well, that's true. Great. You know what I mean? You don't have to dive deeper. You don't have to, you know, go through the process of making your mind up about something and then finding more research, and then it's like, okay, so is everything I thought wrong? Or, so just the fact of not necessarily contradicting yourself, but being open-minded to so many different things. So you're constantly changing your mind because the world is constantly changing. So if you're ignorant or bliss, as they like to say, then I mean, it's like a thing where it's just so much easier to be like that. It's just so much easier, which is not good, but it is easier.
Yeah, I think that that's such a good point. It is easy to be ignorant, right? It takes work to do. I mean, obviously, we're teaching a whole class on how to do this, right? I saw Will had your hand up, so go ahead.
Kind of to piggyback on what Imani just said, there's so much information coming from so many different directions on so many different topics that it's a lot of work to sift through all that and actually make a decision on what you think is true and what's not. So just saying, oh, I read that makes sense to me, I'm going to run with that. It's not just easier, it saves us a lot of time and a lot of headaches trying to figure things out.
Helps if I unmute. I said, hey, just a sec, let me pull this up. So I'm going to call on Aaron, and then after Aaron, Debbie can go. And Aaron, if you're trying to talk, we can't hear you, so you might be muted.
Okay, I was saying, I was thinking about it yesterday that there's a lot of facts that you might find out a while ago, and you don't necessarily go back and check on. You just kind of keep spewing that fact, and it might be 5 years old, and you might think it hasn't changed, but it's so much work to think all right, there's a half-life on this, or an expiration date on this. I just don't know when that is. So every once in a while, I'm just going to check up on every fact I've ever found out to make sure that it's still true when I tell someone, just at a dinner party, fun fact. It's a lot of work. And if you don't, have you ever said a fact randomly at dinner or something like that, and the person's like, that's not true anymore, and then you're just sitting there embarrassed? And it's a lot.
Yeah, spot on. It is a lot. And I mean, even honestly, within the field. So for example, clinicians. I mean, if you're working 60 hours a week, right, seeing clients, it's really hard to go into the scientific literature and keep up with what's going on, right? So yeah, definitely. Debbie, go ahead.
I think too, kind of piggybacking off of all of that, and I find myself doing this sometimes when there's something that's really controversial, and there's a lot of information from two different sides and you don't know what to do. Sometimes if it's not something that I'm not that I don't care about it, but it's not something that really impacts me, I will kind of just say, this is too much and I don't even know. I'm just not even going to bother. I'm not going to think about it. Just, why? Why should I take all the time to do it if I don't care?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, especially if it's something that you just, like Debbie said, you just don't care about. So part of what this made me start thinking about was existential theory. So existential theory really was sort of in reaction to the Industrial Revolution and the fact that existential philosophers and psychologists really felt like people were just sort of now going to work, coming home, being part of the rat race, being a brick in the wall. And so the whole point of existential theory is to regain contact with the experience of being alive, right? These are some quotes from existential theory, hell is other people, take love away and earth is our tomb, and I am, therefore I blank, fill it in. Rollo May is a famous existential psychologist, by the way. But yeah, so sort of the idea that we should break ourselves out of this, right? And there are certainly lots of other not only theories, but pop culture references, right, that do the same thing. So I think in particular about the Matrix, right, there's going to be a fourth Matrix movie coming out, right? That's the whole thing is, you know, gotta break out of this sort of world you've been in. And there are obviously other examples like Alice Through the Looking Glass, things along those lines. Looking at Aaron's comment right now, it's harder to get information if it doesn't affect you. Yeah, how should we know even what we need to Google to look it up, right? Yeah, that's really, really tough. So yeah, this can be is something that's challenging. So on this slide, I just have some important terms from your book. So I liked that they defined psychological literacy as essentially, you know, it's scientific literacy applied to psychology. So you have that, you know, sort of science literacy level of understanding psychological knowledge, but then you have the scientific literacy level of applying those principles to the challenge of personal, social, and community life. And this last part is what psychology ultimately hopes to do as a science. Like our big goal in all the basic research we do, even if the application isn't really clear, is in ultimate service of this aim, right? Of let's find ways to help people with psychological problems. Let's find ways to prevent psychological problems. Let's find ways to navigate and help people understand the racial tensions that exist, right? The other problematic things that exist. You know, let's think about how to best get people to comply with public health information. And so again, even if you're like in a lab working with rats, right, and you never like do anything with a person in terms of research, that basic science research is still an aim of learning about something that will eventually be applied to humans. So this whole idea that we're going to try to work on the betterment of people through it, I think is very important to psychology. Couple other things here. So the outgroup homogeneity bias is very similar to what some of you are talking about. Like if it's not relevant to you, like, are you even gonna like look into it, right? So this is talking more specifically about you, like the people who agree with you versus not, right? So this is our tendency to overlook differences among members of a group that we don't belong to, an outgroup, and instead to perceive all members as essentially the same. This is basically stereotypes, right? So this is where the root of racism comes from. This is where the root of classism comes from. One of the things I like to do in my spare time to sort of take myself away from work is to read, you know, novels. And one of the ones I'm currently reading is talking about, oh, well, you know, the poor all have diseases, right? Again, not true, right? But that is the like way people think about these things sometimes, right? So in-group is the group you belong to, and that is then contrasted with other groups that you might have feelings of either competitiveness or superiority, right? Like, well, I would never do that because I'm better than them. And then an outgroup are the groups that we don't belong to. They're seen as inferior to our in-groups, right? And Dr. Jackson would probably agree with me as a social psychologist. I think that this right here, this bottom box on your slide, is one of the biggest problems with our country today. Honestly, the fact that this exists, it is a cognitive thing. You know, it's not something people are willfully choosing to do. It's just like a tendency. But you have to, like, exactly what Amani said earlier, right? You have to like consciously break out of that in order to challenge it. And a lot of people don't want to do that. So yes, huge thing, very important. All right. This is one of the examples they talked about in your book that I wanted to get into a little bit more. So what do you all think of when you hear the word terrorists? And you can just go ahead and throw some answers in the chat here of like first thing that comes to mind when you think of the word terrorist. 9/11, we just had the 20-year anniversary. Yeah, scary. Definitely. The attack on the Capitol, yes. Although a lot of people wouldn't think of it that way. That's part of what we're going to talk about. But yes, that was an act of terrorism. Sacrifice religion. So yeah, we often think about it in a religious context, right? Mass shootings, for sure, right? Even though, again, yes, actions taken to change mass people's lives, right? And, you know, in Davin's definition, right, actions taken to change mass people's lives to make them afraid, right? The word terror is in the word terrorist for a reason, right? The idea is that by instilling fear, you can somehow alter what people do. So I think that this is still what people think of in general when we think of terrorists, right? We tend to think of people from the Middle East. Yes, Debbie, I agree that they are terrorists, right? And it sounds like, maybe not surprisingly, since you're psychology majors, you already have a much broader definition of terrorists, so that makes my heart happy. But this is what people tend to think of, right? The person of Middle Eastern descent with all these weapons, right? And maybe a suicide bomber or things like that. But these are images of domestic terrorism, which it sounds like some of you are already thinking about, which I appreciate. But oftentimes the news doesn't emphasize, right, that we don't often talk about. So people like the folks who marched on Charlottesville and ran over a woman with their car and killed her, right? The folks who marched on the Capitol in January, right? They were domestic terrorists. A lot of people don't want to name them that way, but what else do you call someone who takes over the seat of government, right? In the country? You know, there's images of the Unabomber on here. So if you're not familiar with him, he was a domestic terrorist. He would put bombs in like the blue postal boxes. I liked that they included the folks who tried to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. If you haven't heard this story, these folks had a plot to kidnap and hold for ransom Michigan's governor because she was taking, in my opinion, and science's opinion, the correct actions to protect the people of her state, right? In terms of asking for masks, school shutdowns, things along those lines. So we tend to think of terrorists, at least the media tends to think of terrorists as like foreign people of color, right? And we tend to excuse, in a lot of cases, these more domestic terrorism examples. So for example, a lot of people don't know that I think it was like 93 or 94, there was a domestic terrorism attack on the World Trade Center. One of the things I remember a lot when I was growing up is the Oklahoma City bombing, which was an act of domestic terrorism. So if you're not familiar with that, it was, they like drove a van full of explosives to the Oklahoma City, I think it was their state capital or one of their government buildings, and blew it up. But again, we don't necessarily hear about these. I really like that people said mass shootings as well, right? Those are acts of terrorism, often perpetrated against minoritized groups, right? Whether that's people of minoritized gender, people of minoritized race, or people who are in need of our protection, like children, right, in schools. So I think that those are often overlooked and excused, right? But in fact, it, you know, is an issue we should be aware of. So these are the official definitions from the FBI's website. Y'all, I actually had to like make sure this was the FBI's website because of the like lack of web design. Like I don't know, I just looked at this and it looked like something someone could make on WordPress, but this is the FBI's website. So here are their definitions. So international versus domestic terrorism. You see they both start with violent criminal acts committed by individuals and or groups, right? And so they talk about designated foreign terrorist organizations or nations, right? So it could be Al-Qaeda or ISIS, or it could be state-sponsored terrorism. I think of some of the cyber terrorism that's come out of places like North Korea or China or Russia, right? And then domestic terrorism is to further ideological goals stemming from domestic influences like political, religious, social, racial, or environmental nature, right? So I really like that they have definitions of both. They're clearly taking domestic terrorism very seriously. Again, even though the media doesn't always, right? All right, then we start to get to some of the big questions, right? So how do we know what we know? So your book goes through a whole bunch of different things related to this. They talk about tenacity or persistence, right? And this is what we've already sort of referenced today, right? It's hard to change things that we already know to be true, right? Like we talked about Pluto before, right? Like Pluto, always a planet in our hearts, right? Even though the science of astronomy, right, says, no, it's not a planet. It's a silly example, but it's a good example of how we can hold on to something for sentimental value, right? Or because it makes sense to us, when in fact the science kind of shows us the opposite. So it's accept knowledge or beliefs because it's comfortable or easier simply to hold on to them. So really getting at, again, what Amani and Aaron were talking about earlier, that like, it's easy not to challenge yourself, right? So I really liked that throughout your chapter, they had these antidotes, right? So recognizing that the beliefs you hold, no matter how strongly, might need to change. Considering the perspective of those who have views counter to yours, right? And this is really hard, especially when, as most of us do, we think we're right, right? So just the idea that I have to listen to someone on the other side, what? And this is why, I mean, sometimes we've had people on college campuses, ours included, honestly, be upset that we have speakers who are conservative, for example, come to campus and speak. It is important to hear all viewpoints. It doesn't mean you have to agree with them. It doesn't mean that you have to just like sort of kowtow to what they say. But if you never hear what the other side is saying, right, you only hear what the other side is saying through someone on your side saying, oh, can you believe they're saying this, right? It's harder to challenge. It's harder to make a good argument. And it's also harder to consider factors that might be applicable, right? True, related to that. All right, so this I think is a really great video. So we'll probably end with this today. I don't quite remember how long it is, but this is Bill Nye, the Science Guy. And he is talking about the fact that he used to be very anti-GMO and then he changed his mind. Oh, sorry, Aaron, I missed your hand. Go ahead.
I was gonna say about the having Republicans come to campus thing. It reminded me, there was this alpha and he was white. And I say that because I don't know if you guys know, but Alpha Phi Alpha is like a historically Black fraternity. So this guy was white and he was an alpha and he went to a Trump rally before the last election. But yeah, that's my face too. But why he went was because he like, no one was gonna like try to hate crime him or anything for going. And he went around and he was like asking people questions and he was really trying to get a genuine like their point of view. And I think he either live streamed or he videotaped a lot of it and put it on the internet and was like, look, now all of you guys can see like their point of view if you want to. Like, he didn't do it because he agreed. He did it because he wanted everyone to be able to get the experience of like all points of view, if that makes sense.
That's great. Yeah. And this is Simba, by the way, for those who haven't met him before. He likes to come Zoom bomb. So, but yeah, Erin, as you were talking, that actually made me think of The Daily Show. So they have a white reporter they'll send to Trump rallies to do the same thing, right? Like they're not sending Trevor Noah because he would get abused. But like he'll go and he'll ask people questions and kind of like sometimes genuinely try to get their opinion, but they don't need to see up your nose, bud. Okay. But some other times genuinely kind of poke fun at them, right? To like, really, that's what you believe, or like catch them in things. But yeah, I think that's important to at least have conversations about the other side, right? And I remember again, connection being made through The Daily Show. When Jon Stewart was still the host, he went on Crossfire. And he told them, if you're not familiar with Crossfire, it was a show where you had a conservative person and a liberal person, and they just yelled at each other the whole time, pretty much. And he told them literally, he said, stop hurting America. Because this dichotomy and like assuming everything was opposed, right, is problematic. So yeah, thanks for sharing that, Erin. That's such a great example of not only how you can challenge yourself, right, but also a great allyship to do that for people who are not allowed to or can't do that safely. All right, so
this is Star
perfect.
Talk.
This is about take it in the class.
I have a ton of questions from GMOs, and they are all, here's the weird thing, and I don't know, they are all addressed. They're saying, Bill, dear Mr. Nye, dearest Mr. Nye, why are all these people asking you about GMOs?
Here's the thing.
Okay.
I wrote a book, a New York Times bestseller, Undeniable, Evolution and the Science of Creation.
Yes.
And in that book, I had...
By the way, it's a great book.
I love you, man.
Yeah.
By the way, in that, or the point is, or the thing of it is, in the book, I have a chapter about genetically modified organisms.
Right.
And at that time, when I wrote it, I said, it's always good to be cautious. It's, you don't know what you're going to do to the ecosystem. But this led to controversy because it turns out GMOs, in my opinion, I spent some more time. I met the guy who won the World Food Prize.
Okay.
Rob Fraley won. It's like the Nobel Prize for farming, for agriculture.
For agriculture.
And he's, in my opinion, really not such a bad guy. And he believes that we can raise more food than ever on less land. In other words, we have 7.2, almost 7.3 billion people on Earth today.
Okay.
He believes, or his colleagues, believe they can raise food for 9 billion people on 2% less land.
Which is great.
That's a noble goal.
That is a noble goal.
And here's the thing that happened, in my opinion. Monsanto developed something called glyphosate.
Okay.
Or rather, a salt of glyphosate. This is a way to put this chemical onto soil and have it stay there pretty well.
Okay.
Anyway, it kills everything that's green. Kills everything by inhibiting the shikimate acid pathway.
So you're literally salting the earth.
Yes.
So.
Yes. However, what Rob Fraley and these several other guys who were working at Monsanto, they behated Monsanto, what they did is develop a gene that lets the shikimic acid pathway get completed in the green plant anyway.
Gotcha.
And this is the so-called Roundup ready soybean, corn, cotton was the first one.
Right.
And there's two things.
So now everybody is familiar with Roundup as a weed killer.
It does kill weeds. It kills any green plant.
Any green plant.
With a couple exceptions, which are quite relevant. Anyway, he argues that glyphosate's really not such a bad thing. Compared to all the other herbicides, glyphosate's pretty benign. which I've done research now and I've decided that's true. I've changed my mind about genetically modified foods. That's the top line.
So it's the top line. You've changed your mind about GMOs.
And so I looked into it. There's no difference between allergies among GMO eaters and non-GMO eaters. There is a big difference in inputs from an agricultural standpoint. Organic farming takes a lot more water, takes a lot more tillage.
Yes.
It ends up, actually, you end up with less diversity of microbes in the soil with modern Roundup ready crops, because you don't have to till, you don't have to turn the soil over to kill the weeds.
Right.
However, there is a notorious weed called pigweed, which is every bit as friendly as it sounds.
Oh, okay.
And
But is it as
Aranthus
delicious
family.
as bacon?
Actually, people used to eat the leaves of Aranthus plants, but now it's considered a weed because you have to go to a lot of trouble to get the food worth out of it.
Gotcha.
And it has a redundant gene now. In other words, it has evolved over the last couple decades.
Okay.
So that it has it amplified the gene that makes the shikimic acid. And so Roundup doesn't kill it.
You can't kill it.
Yeah. So
now you have a Roundup resistant weed
that's
now.
what you got. So
All right, so we got most of the point. If you're interested, obviously there's a link to that and you can watch it, the rest of it on your own time. But essentially the big thing I wanted to show you is the part in the middle where he said, I have changed my mind, right? And it kind of takes a big person to be able to do that. And it also takes, an ability to really be willing to look at the other side. And in his case, actually, because of his status as a science educator, was able to talk to people on the other side who were pretty high up, which I thought was pretty great. Okay, so plan to meet on Zoom on Friday, unless I tell you otherwise. And we'll finish this, and I'll also leave time for questions about the exam as well. And the exam will be Monday, hopefully in class, in person. Hopefully everything will be okay by then. The school will be reopened, all that good stuff. So again, thank you all for being flexible. Very much appreciate it. And I will talk to you all later.
Bye.